Welcome in the arena. My name's Allyson Klein, and this is a Data Insights episode, which means I'm here with Jeniece Wnorowski. Jeniece, how you doing?
Hi, Allyson. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm great. I'm really excited for our conversation today, and I know that you brought someone really special with you. Why don't you introduce our guest and talk about the topic that we're going to be discussing today?
Yeah, thank you. Today we have Atif Ansar. Atif, thank you so much for joining us today. We've
Pleasure.
had a lot of, Allyson, we've had a lot of conversation on the topic of AI factories, neo clouds. We've talked a lot about just the world of AI. What is the infrastructure doing? What are they up to? What does it look like? But it's very rare that we have the opportunity to meet an organization that's kind of helping to deliver on-time projects, really complex on-time projects for data center build-outs. I'm excited to have Ansar here and to talk a little bit more about what Foresight is up to.
So, Atif, welcome to the program. I just want to start with, can you introduce Foresight Works? This is the first time Foresight Works has been on TechArena. And tell us a little bit about what your leadership at Foresight Works is responsible for.
Well, thank you. And Allyson, Jeniece, it's a pleasure to be here with you. So Foresight is a project delivery system powered, of course, with AI, but also a proprietary data set and methods that I developed over 15 years of academic work at Oxford University. And the basic idea is, projects are human systems and they require a really unique way of delivering them to get them right, which is what we help people do. Projects are also maturity journeys. So it's not just about getting good outcomes, like delivering them on time, but also about good process. So Foresight is a way for people to create that process, almost like a fitness app, if you will, of how to, not just produce good outcomes, but also deliver them with a maturity so you can build a repeatable, consistent platform. I'm one of the co-founders. So my role is in providing the product vision, also making sure that our data science models are built really well, and then leading our go-to-market efforts as well.
Amazing. So, Atif, a lot of the AI infrastructure conversation is framed around technical bottlenecks, but you've made the case for this bigger gap is more about execution and leadership. Why is the human element of all of this becoming a limiting factor?
Great question, Jeniece. So look, our mission is world-class project delivery. And like I mentioned earlier, world-class project delivery is both about outcomes, but also about the human process with which we go about it. What my research at Oxford University showed is that people bring tremendous skill, tremendous genius and energies to when they're building projects, but we also bring our biases, and we have political biases as well as psychological biases. Psychological biases of the nature of being just overly optimistic. So even low stakes tasks like grabbing a coffee, I might say to you, Jeniece, hey, I'll be back from a coffee in 5 minutes. But if you clock me, I might be back in 10 minutes or 20 minutes. It's very unlikely I'll be back in 5 minutes. It's much more likely that I'm going to take a lot longer than that. And we don't necessarily think about it. And it's not like I'm being malicious in that. It's just simply we don't necessarily forecast all the impediments to what we may encounter in even completing a small task like grabbing a coffee, and these problems magnify at a project level. The antidote to that, of course, is both better planning, which in the literature, Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics for this in 2002. He calls that the inside view. So you have to develop a very detailed movie reel of the future of how is it that your project's going to go, from achieving the funding released, ensuring that your architectural models are properly coordinated, up to doing the procurement. All of that's got to be documented in a pretty clear database of some sort. And second, then from executing against that in a very diligent manner. So Foresight is really a platform that enables people to both build those plans, what we call generative scheduling, but then also track against them what we call generative control, in being able to make sure that they're meeting their micro daily commitments, which then add up to the monthly and annual goals in terms of where the project's going to end up.
Atif, doing my research on the show, I came across some things that you'd said about the AI bubble. And most people posit that the AI bubble is about diminishing demand at some point, but you've argued that that bubble risk is actually whether companies can deliver what's already been contracted. Can you explain that framing?
So look, as we all know, there's just a huge amount of capital going into AI infrastructure right now. There were about 500 megawatts worth of data centers being built 5 years ago. There's at least 10 gigawatts that have been announced or under construction in one way or another. So just the gap is massive. Now, many people fear that this massive supply of new capacity is not going to find any buyers, and we will be stuck with extremely expensive AI factories that are unused. What I've argued previously is that that's simply not the case for two reasons. First of all, we're seeing the revenues of all of these AI companies accelerate really rapidly. So with Claude or ChatGPT, I'm sure you've seen the revenue numbers are through the roof. And in our own daily use, I'm sure this podcast video is going to go through some form of AI to correct my ums and ahs at some point. So all of that is consuming a lot of server space in some data center around the world. And demand is not an issue. And we see that in the revenue as well. A second kind of thing that's helping data centers, and these are not speculative investments. They are built under contract. So unlike the old telecom bubble of 2001 or sort of 2000, when the telecom towers were being built speculatively, these data centers are being built under contract from very high rated companies like hyperscalers. And as a result, they have 15-year leases. So the developers are not taking a huge amount of risk. And as a result, the investors also have the backing of a lease from a Microsoft or Amazon Web Services. So these are not speculative investments. These are ultimately creditworthy investments. So in all of that, the key variable that can potentially let the data center builders down is if they fail to meet their lease commitment. Because these leases are so strict, and because of their finite nature of a 10 or 15-year lease commitment, every month's delay on average costs them $15 million or more if it's a 100 megawatt data center, and much more if it's a bigger data center. And that early revenue, because of the way financial models work, is the most valuable revenue, and it's never going to come back. So basically, more than a 3-month delay dissipates the net present value of even a very, very large build. On top of the lost revenue, you have the issue of service credits or the SLA penalties, because hyperscalers themselves are so exposed to this. So they extract a pound of flesh for you being late. And that basically means that the economics of these can become very adverse, not because the demand isn't there, but because there is demand, and the revenue overriding, and as well as the penalties for missing your targets becomes, potentially insolvency causing for companies that are not well managed.
Okay, you've drawn parallels to kind of seeing abandoned infrastructure projects growing up, and not so much failures of funding, but failures of planning. Where do you see that same dynamic showing up in today's data center build-outs?
So look, there's a tendency in the market to introduce or announce quite a lot of what we call bragawatts. So these are commitments that people make in the market, pre-funding, and people do that partly because they may have a piece of land, they're trying to improve the value of the land, they may not have secured the power, they're all sorts of reasons for announcing, or also to scare their customers. There's a lot of kind of game theory in this very dynamic market that's going on. The key is people know who the mature developers are, and that's exhibited through their process maturity. So one thing we are noticing is that a very large number of projects are getting cancelled because of community opposition. And what I've argued is that communities have a pretty good sense. It's not just NIMBYism, which is what it gets blamed on. Communities have a pretty good smell test for whether or not the developer is a sensible, reasonable citizen that is also going to create prosperity both for their own company and their community. Or are they a cowboy that's trying to make a quick buck? And communities have a good smell test for that. And if they smell a cowboy, they don't want them in there. But if they smell a responsible citizen, they definitely want those jobs. They definitely want those schools. And the process maturity that produces on-time delivery is also the same process maturity that produces better relationships with community. It's sort of a way of thinking about the world and of being organized and orderly in your business conduct, which leads to these good outcomes. Hence my emphasis on the strategic governance piece again and again. the projects that get cancelled are the ones, there's nothing wrong with the project per se, but it's their preparation is so poor that they can't build the confidence in the communities, in the investors, in the hyperscalers to be able to get them off the ground.
There's a nuance here about process and process management as well. And one of the things that I've experienced a lot in terms of complex projects inside large organizations is that projects often look on track when they suddenly aren't. And, I think that data center build-outs would be the uber example of this. What has your experience been in this scope, and how do you see large organizations navigating this challenge?
Great question, Allyson. So this issue of projects kind of looking like they're on time and then suddenly not is what we call the watermelon problem. So all projects look green from the outside until they suddenly turn red. And it's an infuriating problem because there's a lot of both emotional as well as financial baggage, right? So often this arises because of the over-optimism that both the political as well as the psychological bias that I referred to. So people hope they'll catch up, but they don't. The purchase orders that should have been issued for procurement that haven't been issued. The problem with projects is they are very interdependent systems. So lots of things depend on each other. So in order for you to get your equipment 6 months from today, you need to place the purchase order today. If somebody forgets to do that, you're not going to have that piece of equipment 6 months from now. But you will discover that delay 6 months from now unless you're tracking it very vigilantly today. So I think that's precisely where we build Foresight as this control tower that is able to both provide what needs to happen in real time, but then also give people the visibility that they can dive into the most minutest tasks and observe those variances as quickly as possible at given, whichever level they might be at, because very, very small variances, death by 1,000 cuts, as we call it, can really derail projects and cause these kind of surprise bad outcomes to happen all of a sudden.
In one case, you've actually uncovered a 5-month delay kind of hidden beneath distorted reporting. How do these gaps emerge in practice?
Look, there's lots of causes. When I was a younger academic, in my academic days, I was always very attracted to big, singular, dramatic events that cause the delay, like a big flood or a big supply chain disruption or a utility not making the commitment. As I sort of got more matured in my own thinking and looked at the data more and more closely, these big events matter. I'm not denying that they don't exist or they don't matter. But really what lets people down is the accumulation of these very small variances. And then I myself became very interested in skiing as an athletic hobby. And I realized that sports is the same. Like really good athletes obsess about micro details, be it in tennis or in skiing or golf. And it's actually those micro details that make the difference between elite performance and average performance type of thing. So same thing with projects, that it's like really focusing on both the big macro picture, of course, which executives are clearly drawn to, but then also having this handle on the micro issues and just being on top of it. And, all of it basically leads to, again, creating this very detailed plan of your, and I'm not necessarily talking about thousands upon thousands of rows, but having a very, very clear idea of what sort of design, procurement, physical works, NEP works, etc. you need commissioning in order to get to a complete project. To give you like a quick tip, for example, one thing that we've discovered again and again is people love concrete. So there's a lot of construction, civil and structural activities that are readily represented in the schedule. Mechanical, electric, and plumbing, because it's much more gnarly, but people just kind of like put it in a very broad brushstrokes. And because it's so gnarly, that's where you have a lot of delays. Nearly 60 to 80% of a data center is MEP. So unless you really define your MEP footprint very clearly, you will have a delay. As much as it's not vivid and colorful like a precast concrete the building envelope might be. Similarly with commissioning. So people sort of put all of commissioning on the back end of a big data center and think they're going to get it done in 3 months. What we found is the level 1 and level 2 commissioning, which is the factory acceptance tests and site acceptance tests, have to happen way before the commissioning phase really begins in earnest. And unless you've done that work, almost co-joined with your procurement and with your equipment deliveries, it's going to be very hard to commission in anything under 6 months, for example. So there's sort of a lot of things that people learn by experience as well. And that's partly because that's why I'm most excited about the world of AI is it can take a lot of human heuristics, a lot of human experience of what's worked really well, and kind of begin to build a library of knowledge for you, which helps to onboard younger employees who just joined or people who come from other sectors, irrespective of age, can, onboard them really, really quickly into that particular trade or into that particular way of building.
Now, you emphasize something called sequence and favor that over activity lists, if you will. Why is this so important when you're considering hyperscale builds?
So this matters in all sorts of construction, but particularly in data centers, there's a kind of a path of building them. And data centers are particularly linear or serial forms of construction. In many ways, they're basically very large computers. And like how computers execute software programs, they have to sort of execute a chain of command of the sort of things that need to happen in order to build a data center. So what we've seen in the industry is a lot of people rely on Excel spreadsheets to basically create a very long list of activities that they want to do, in order to get a project built. The reality is that these activities are interdependent. So unless, for example, you've done a design review of a particular piece of equipment, your PO that you're going to issue can't be quite right. And unless that PO is issued, it's not going to get delivered on time, at which point it needs to have a site acceptance test, and only then it should be installed. So people, for example, rush into issuing the POs without doing the design reviews. They then receive the piece of equipment. They forget to do the site acceptance test. And then when they come to installing it, suddenly realize, oh gosh, those bus bars don't fit anymore. They're the wrong bus bars. Well, we could have told you that 8 months ago, based on those misses. But it also means having a culture in which people listen to that without, just railroading through these misses.
Yeah. And Atif, you said you were really excited about AI being able to implement a lot of this, and you've actually done so. You've used AI to kind of stress test schedules before major capital is committed. And so with that, what does that surface that traditional planning kind of misses?
Fantastic question, Jeniece. So I think one of the key things that we find again and again is that when people build schedules, to Allyson's earlier point as well, they contain a very large laundry list of activities they need to get done. It's a little bit like if you heard the analogy about the rock, pebbles, and sand. If you're trying to fill a jar with rocks, pebbles, and sand, if you start with the sand, you can't get any rocks and pebbles in. So a lot of the times these schedules are filled with sand. So they'll contain hundreds of activities about putting, cable or installing pipe, but they'll be missing the rocks like electrical room complete or mechanical corridors complete. So when we're passing through this data with our AI, some of the things we're looking for is they may have the sandy detail, but does that sandy detail culminate into these rocks and pebbles that as an executive can rely on to know that like certain big elements of the project have been achieved, certain waypoints have been crossed. So some of the ways in which we enrich that data is by analyzing that network. We help them look at what milestones they are likely missing or what gates they're likely missing and help them insert those back in the appropriate places and link them in the right places to make sure they've got a schedule that hangs together really well. And that then helps to not just align the front line, which tends to think in very tactical ways, but also the top line, which tends to think in these episodic gates. So obviously pulling cable and installing pipe racks is heroic work, but none of that matters unless the electrical room is done. And making sure that both those things are working in tandem are some ways in which AI helps to create that coordination between the good work that happens on site, as well as the way people think about projects in the HQ.
Now, as AI infrastructure scales from single sites to portfolio level programs, what leadership and management gaps become most exposed in your mind?
So I think big projects and big portfolios need big people. And I think that's the biggest thing that gets exposed is your ability to zoom out and look at the whole system in its totality. I think a lot of people are technically extremely competent and adept, but that can also mean that they can be very, very narrow in terms of their approach. And data centers are becoming so complex. They're almost as complex as old refineries these days. Just by being very good at one thing is no guarantee that the entire integrated system is going to hang together. So I think what's getting exposed is this need for people to be able to, almost like a T model, both be able to dive in deep into their specific domain of which they're an expert, but even more importantly, to abstract themselves out of that domain and think in a much more horizontal, much more integrated system sort of way to make sure that the thing hangs together. So to use an analogy, it's not just that, if you're trying to put Humpty Dumpty together, it's not just that you're worrying about the individual fingers, that they're in place. You've got to put together the torso and the head and the limbs have all got to go in the right place. And I think what's becoming really crucial for people, and this is, by the way, something only people can do, is to take that system level view where AI is really valuable, is then surfacing aggregate insights that help people kind of look up from their immediate context and take that big view.
So zooming out, you said execution problem is bigger than data centers, right? It affects the energy transition and future prosperity. Why is delivery capacity becoming such a critical constraint?
Well, look, first of all, there's just a lot going on in the world, right? So we're building a lot. The world is undergoing at least 3 massive revolutions all at the same time. One is the digital infrastructure, which is the AI build out and all the telecom and data infrastructure, digital infrastructure that goes with it. Second is the energy infrastructure, not just to power the digital infrastructure, but the climate change issue that we've had for a number of years and the energy transition that goes along with it. So that problem hasn't gone away. So people are still investing heavily in simply keeping pace with the total volume of energy that needs to be built in the world and total volume of clean energy that needs to be built in the world. And third, given the geopolitical dimension, a massive change in defense and defense-related spending. So all of that's meant that the total project delivery needs are just more magnified today than they have been in previous decades. And that's just 3 sectors. You have evergreen sectors like pharmaceuticals or even poverty alleviation, building schools, social infrastructure. None of that is going away. So the pressure is intense in terms of both the construction as well as delivery of it. So that's kind of the demand side on one aspect. The second is supply of skills. So, we just don't have enough people in the world right now, skilled people, to be able to keep pace with this level of change. To give you an example, there's about $1 trillion worth of data centers being built in the world. That's about 10% of the global construction market. Yet the number of people working in the data center industry is just 0.05% of the total construction labor force. So there's a massive mismatch between what they're trying to build in terms of construction volume and just number of people involved in the industry. So it's still a cottage industry in terms of the footprint. So I think that those bottlenecks are, again, they need a lot of technology, automation, and AI to simply keep pace. They also need education. So I'm still remain an educator at heart. And I think that we just also need to upskill people and train them in the art of becoming better project managers, which is kind of core to my personal mission as we build Foresight.
Now, I have one final question for you. For executives investing significant capital into AI infrastructure today, you talked about the $1 trillion of investment collectively. What discipline or mindset shift matters most to ensure that these projects actually get from ideation to deployment?
Great. So I think the key mindset is what a colleague of mine at Oxford, Ben Freiberg, calls think slow, act fast. The default tendency is very action oriented, which I like. I'm an entrepreneur, so bias to action is a good thing. But when you're thinking in a strategic investment framework, you can't be fast tracking your projects, because trying to put shovels in the ground as quickly as possible is actually going to slow you down drastically, is going to get a blowback from the communities. People want thought through investment ideas, not rushed ideas. So, think platform, think repeatable, think consistent, think long-term, think structured, think process in order to get those really good outcomes. And that's kind of what Foresight is trying to create, is this process of think in a very clearly orderly fashion right up front, build those systems right up front, put in place that strategic governance, and then you have a platform to be able to do repeatable projects again and again in a solid, orderly manner.
This is fascinating, Atif. Where can our listeners go to follow you and get more information about your work?
So please follow me on LinkedIn at Atif Ansar, Dr. Atif Ansar. And please also visit Foresight on www.foresight.works. We'd love to stay in touch with you.
Atif, that was so fascinating. Thank you so much for walking us through this. I would love to have you back on the program some point. And Jeniece, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Allyson. Thank you, Atif.
I'd hope to see you guys again.